BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast, where we take stock of the apple harvest, hear how Scottish farming policy is panning out, and avian flu is back in the UK, and in America it's prevalent in the dairy herd, something which worries scientists.
We have to be concerned about H5N1 in cattle because of the zoonotic risk. We know that humans can be infected, and actually every time a human gets infected, that increases the risk of a virus adapting to human transmission.
We'll have more on that a little later. First, though, to the apple harvest. In the UK, the harvest is just finishing. Growers are reporting that although the wet weather's made picking very difficult, the crop is high quality this year. But for growers who employ many seasonal staff, the recent budget is giving cause for concern. Ali Kappa is Executive Chair of British Apples and Pears.
The red colour on the apples came really early this year. So we've got a really vibrant looking crop, which is brilliant because people do buy with their eyes. The sugar levels are very good and the size has been spot on as well. So generally speaking, happy growers until they had to pick in the rain. And I have to say the harvest has probably been the hardest in living memory. One doesn't expect to be picking apples and creating huge ruts in the orchards. I was talking to one grower at the National Fruit Show last week, and he said he had ruts up to his knees. That comes at a cost. There is going to have to be repair work that we'll have to undertake during the spring.
Last year we reported on farmers grubbing up orchards. What actually happened, and is there less fruit being produced this year because of that?
It's really hard to tally production levels to how much fruit is in the ground. Last year's crop was the lowest that we'd had for about 5 years because of frost. And this year's crop, by comparison, is much better because we didn't get those frosts. So I can't really make that comparison. The hectarage is the lowest it's been for 5 years, but it's not significant. There is definitely, before the budget, there was definitely more optimism in the sector. The retailers are definitely wanting longer term relationships. They're definitely stepping up and understanding the inflation pressures that growers have had. So growers were definitely feeling more optimistic about things.
So how is the budget going to affect orchard owners, do you think? I mean, there's the increase in national insurance payments for employers and also a rise in the national living wage.
The combination of the new national living wage, which is a 6.8% increase, the lower NI threshold and the new NI rate will add over 10% to the wage bill in April 2025. That is inflationary. There is no doubt that that will put food prices up. We're hearing that from the supermarkets, and we will have to pass that on to retailers. We have no choice.
We asked the DEFRA Secretary of State about the rise in the national living wage. You say it's inflationary. He said it would stimulate growth. Isn't it better for everyone if people have more money to spend?
I don't think this government understands how important family businesses are to economic growth. Every business owner I'm speaking to is discussing redundancy because they've got no choice. They don't feel that they can pass these costs on. So they are starting to look at how they tighten their belts and run their business in a different way. And I think that will mean less people being employed. So I can't see how it's going to drive the economy.
If we're talking about increase in costs then for you, does that mean that you think supermarkets will look abroad to import more apples instead of buying British?
Inevitably. But I think retailers do understand that that is becoming harder because the Climate change is having an impact on some of the key growing regions in the world. We've seen that with the recent awful flooding and, in fact, hailstorms, which weren't much reported in Spain in the storms the week before last. That's having an impact today on the supply into UK retail. So there just isn't the resilience in those import supply chains that there once was.
Ali Kappa from British Apples and Pears. All week we're taking a closer look at the future for farming in Scotland. As a devolved issue, all the 4 nations of the UK are in charge of setting their own policies and budgets for farm support. As we heard yesterday, after leaving the EU, Scotland decided to maintain the payments farmers have been receiving, but now farmers need to meet certain environmental targets to receive them. Scotland's new Agriculture Act came into force in June, and NFU Scotland says it got what it wanted from the Act, but with much of the legislation aimed at improving the environment and with little detail as yet, there are still concerns over what the changes will actually mean, as Richard Baines has been finding out.
We have sought early engagement with the UK Government to work towards a reset in that relationship.
Scottish Agriculture Minister Jim Fairley struck an optimistic note here at the NFU Scotland Autumn Conference.
I must admit, so far, the reception has been miles better than it has been in the previous government.
NFU Scotland was also positive, in their case, about the Scottish Government's new Agriculture Act.
The Agriculture Act is absolutely what we wanted in many, many ways.
Johnny Hall is the union's policy director.
Within that Act, there are the powers to deliver the right sort of support to enable farmers and crofters in Scotland to deliver on food, climate and biodiversity, as well as underpinning rural communities. It's now about turning that primary legislation into something meaningful in terms of delivery on the ground.
But that detail of delivery on the ground is what concerned farmers at the conference, especially the Act's emphasis on environmental protection. Jen Stewart and her family farm near St Andrews in Fife.
There will appear to be support being provided going forward, but the concern is that food security is not perhaps going to be as much of a priority as the environmental side.
Alex Ritchie farms in Perthshire.
We don't know enough to know the exact impact it's going to have yet. We're already doing a lot for improving biodiversity on the farm, so we're hoping that we're prepared for it. But again, until we know more, we won't know exactly what impact it'll have.
The chair of the NFUS Next Generation Committee is 28-year-old Ben McClymont.
There's a lack of confidence and clarity as to what will our sort of future support network look like in Scotland. It's difficult to try and encourage confidence in younger people to go to a more environmentally linked payment system. Then that concerns me, because not everybody will be able to undertake the measures in which may well be needed.
There seems to be this idea that if you've no grazing animals and you've got no economic activity, you've got this wonderful flora and fauna.
In the Highlands, there's been a lot of pressure because of environmental concerns. Ian Wilson is the union's manager for the region.
The reality is, once the grazing animals are removed, you quickly get taken over by non-desired species of plants.
Ian worries that some of the Act's terms around green issues are ill-defined.
Regenerative seems to be a new word. The first assumption for something to regenerate is that it's really broken, when in an awful lot of cases it's a small tweak we're needing to improve things, and too much of those people thinking about regenerative and what they're targeting is actually going to knacker the thing, because they're going too far one way without realising the total consequences.
For Johnny Hall, the changes have been handled better here than elsewhere.
Right now, if I was a farmer anywhere in the UK, I'd want to be in Scotland rather than anywhere else. The pace of change in England has really not worked in terms of taking farming in the right direction. Whereas the pace of change here in Scotland, albeit somewhat glacial at times, has allowed farming and crofting to adjust, and will allow farming and crofting to adjust to what is going to be asked of it without undermining it.
Whatever happens, he says, the NFUS will keep up pressure on the Scottish Government to ensure farmers get the right deal.
We shouldn't kid ourselves that there's a binary choice between food production and agricultural activity and delivering for climate and the environment. Get it right for farmers and crofters, you'll get it right in terms of delivery of the outcomes that everybody wants to see.
Johnny Hall from the NFUS, ending that report by Richard Baines. Bird flu is back. 2 years ago, a strain of the virus called H5N1 caused outbreaks across the world, including the UK, killing millions of birds on poultry farms and in the wild. In America, that same strain has infected dairy cows on nearly 500 different farms, and in some cases also been passed on to humans. The UK has just seen its first avian flu outbreak of the winter in a commercial poultry flock in the East Riding of Yorkshire. This time the strain's been identified as H5N5. I asked Professor James Wood, a veterinary epidemiologist at the University of Cambridge, what difference that makes.
The single strain of H5N5 that has been infecting wild birds around Europe for the last 2 or 3 years has had the observed characteristic of just persisting at a fairly low level and not often transmitting into farms. But of course that may change, and the thing that we have to be very careful about is that we don't just ignore a single farm because it hasn't caused huge problems before, because these viruses can always change.
So we have had this one case so far. Does that mean we should expect more?
Well, hopefully we won't. I think we should expect to see ongoing cases in wild birds, in particular around the coast, as have been seen in particular over recent months. With good biosecurity on farms, good hygienic practices, there's no reason why other farms should become infected with this particular virus.
Has H5N1 actually gone away then, or is it lurking?
Well, we know that H5N1 is causing huge problems still globally. It's just that in Northern Europe, we've seen far fewer, or in the case of Britain, no recent cases even in wild birds. But it's causing huge problems in the North American dairy cattle industry, where there's been a lot of farm-to-farm transmission of this infection and quite a large number of people infected with it as well who've been in contact with dairy herds.
Do we know how that's happening and why it's happening?
The movement of the H5N1 virus into cattle occurred in Texas in the spring of 2024, so 6 or so months ago, and it has transmitted between dairy herds only around most parts of the USA. It's almost certainly been carried by cattle movement, which under American legislation has not been restricted because of this infection. We know that transmission on the farm has been facilitated or driven almost entirely through the milking process.
How does that work on the farm in the milking process then?
Modern milking machines are very good at either cleaning themselves or being cleaned between cattle, but there's such high levels of virus in milk of infected cattle that unfortunately it's been able to overcome those quite good cleansing methods. And there's a little bit of backflow of milk at some points of the milking cycle, and that can be enough to get the infection into the udders, into the mammary glands of cattle that haven't yet been infected, and then the cycle continues.
Does it affect the cows themselves?
The cattle have mostly recovered from this if they've been infected, but they will get high temperatures and generally be very ill. There'll be some respiratory symptoms and some evidence of mastitis. We have to be concerned about H5N1 in cattle because of the zoonotic risk. We know that humans can be infected, and actually every time a human gets infected, that increases the risk of a virus adapting to human transmission.
Does this connection between avian flu and dairy farming have any implications here in the UK?
We are looking very carefully at this. I think there is optimism that were this infection to spread to anywhere in Europe, the legislative framework within Europe and in the UK would mean that we could, through simple movement restrictions, which can be transient, we could control this very rapidly.
Professor James Wood from the University of Cambridge. That's all from us. I'm Anna Hill. The producer is Heather Simons. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.